There are many definitions of sustainability. Here at Semcorp, sustainability is safeguarding the future. To us, that future is bright. We harness the power of the sun and wind, design low-carbon sustainable solutions for green urban cities, and lay the foundation for generations to come. Sustainability is innovation, challenging the norms and leading disruption. We innovate to solve complex global problems. We use our experiences to create opportunities from challenges. Sustainability is about the communities. We care for the communities and aim to improve their quality of life. We forge strong partnerships and leverage our platforms in the region to deliver sustainable solutions. Our success is founded upon the trust from the communities we serve. Sustainability is about our people. Our success is bolstered by the strength and energy of one Semcorp team, a team that can thrive in the current and future world. Sustainability is not just a catchphrase. To us, sustainability is our business.
Good morning, everybody, or good evening to those who are in the evening time zone. This is the Thinktank Roundtable hosted by Institute of Energy Economics Japan, and the topic is driving the clean energy transition in ASEAN and Japan. My name is Yukari Yamashita. I'm a managing director of the Institute of Energy Economics Japan, and I will make a keynote presentation today and then moderate the panel discussion. If the secretariat can pull out my, okay, thank you very much. So I will give you a brief keynote presentation regarding the topic today. Please, the next slide. Today, I would like to touch upon the Japan's 6th Basic Energy Strategy, which has been approved just recently. I would like to touch upon only main points, and then I will introduce you to our latest outlook, which actually should be read 2022, but it's about the general global outlook, but we also cover many relevant topics to today's discussion. So I would like to cover something from that outlook, for example, where we stand in meeting carbon neutral by 2050, what to expect towards 2050, and some challenges. Next slide, please. Japan has recently agreed on the basic energy strategy, and then that has a few basic approaches towards 2030, looking at the 2050's target of carbon neutrality. First is a deeper energy efficiency improvement and an energy saving. If you look on the left-hand chart, we are aiming at the very deep cut in energy consumption by improving energy efficiency, just nearly the same as the period where we were experiencing two oil crisis. That means it's a very hard challenge. And of course, they electrify as many sectors and usages as possible to move away from the fossil fuel usage and then use a lot of renewables. That means decarbonization of power generation and fuel switching, shift away from coal and oil, and maybe lighter emitting fossil fuel such as gas. On the right-hand side, you can see the load curve management image. Since we are going to introduce a lot of solar and wind, there may be some period, especially during the midday, where we have too much generation from these renewable power, then we have to, we wish to store that extra part of the power generation for the evening where the sun is not shining. So we need to also introduce the storage system like the batteries or even utilize the pumping hydro. Of course, we will continue to use the nuclear, and then the thermal until up to 2030, we still have the thermal power in the picture so that we can actually back up the fluctuating solar and hydrogen. Next, please. So this is the main part of our discussion in our 2030 target. We call it energy mix. That is actually how we supply the power demand, which we hope to reduce from the current level to down to this middle new plan level, introducing more efficiency. Even though we electrify more, we hope also to reduce the power demand. And on the right-hand side is how the plan, how to supply this power demand. We will shift away from the fossil fuel thermal plants towards the non-fossil fuel plants such as renewables and nuclear. We hope to increase the share of the renewable power source rather than in comparison to the old plan, which was a little bit the same as the nuclear, but we will shift towards more renewables in the 2030 power supply. Next, please. So in the end, we will have as I showed, the reduced power demand and then reduced primary energy demand. Therefore, we will aim at just 45% decrease of the CO2 emission, energy-related CO2 emissions in comparison to our base year 2013 to 2030. Next, please. So what does that mean? Well, as I said, we aim at deeper energy efficiency improvement and energy saving, and we electrify as many sectors and usage as possible, decarbonize the power generation, and we fuel switch, shift away from the coal and oil towards gas. But that means we need more tools to utilize efficiency potential. We also need to tackle to decarbonize transport or industrial sectors, but they will remain difficult to electrify. The nuclear restart is slow at the moment while plants are getting old. Accommodating increasing variable renewable electricity is a challenge. We need to connect them to the system. We need to address their fluctuations. So we need to have more batteries, and we may have issues in the reserve ratio from time to time if the weather doesn't allow us to have more renewable power. And also, if we are to shift to the gas, too much dependence on one energy, which is natural gas, may cause traditional energy security concern more frequently. We are seeing that coming, or we are seeing it happening in the world actually, and then that will keep us very much alert towards the energy security of the traditional kind. And that is the 2030 target. And then we also exercise the scenario analysis up to the 2050. And then that includes yet to be innovative technologies. So you can see how much higher the hurdle would be to meet the carbon neutrality target by 2050. Next, please. So now we go to the IEEJ outlook. I'm so sorry, I keep using 2021, but our new outlook is actually 2022. So by the time we upload this slide, I will correct this mistake. Next, please. So our 2022 outlook starts by talking about the energy-related CO2 emission, the global picture, and compare our regular reference scenario and advanced technology scenario, and then how it will look if we assume that all these carbon neutrality declared countries meet the target, and then deep cut their emission. Unfortunately, it will meet only up to the half the cut of the CO2 emissions by 2050, which is actually compatible with the 2.0 degree target of the IPCC. So we need a deeper cut. And then why is that? Is because on the right-hand side, even though over 120 countries and regions have declared carbon neutrality objective, it mainly consists of the advanced economies or a few Latin American countries and China. And the rest of the world are going to emit for up until 2050. And that's why we have still the remaining half which need to be addressed. Next, please. And if we look at the energy-related CO2 emission, dividing that into the advanced economies and emerging and developing economies, you can see very clearly. Advanced economies emission has already started to decline, while the emerging or developing economies will keep emitting because their economic development level is yet to catch up with the advanced economies level. If you can see on the right-hand side, the energy consumption per capita is still yet to catch up with the average, world average, especially for India or ASEAN or the Africa. So therefore, we see into the future, advanced economies and then China and some Latin Americans will see the decrease in energy consumption, therefore the emissions reduction. And on the other hand, the other part of the world will still have to do something or to be endorsed with the technologies to address the increasing energy demand and therefore the CO2 emissions. Next slide, please. So what is common for both regions, advanced or the emerging and developing economies, is that the electricity ratio will keep increasing towards the future. So the power demand is expected to grow into the future around the world. Next, please. And then, of course, we aim at decarbonization, totally decarbonized by 2050 as a whole of the world. We see the zero emission power generation ratio will increase in both developed and developing regions. Next, please. So what is the challenge is, in addition to addressing these growing economy in the world and then their energy consumption increase and then the CO2 emission increase, is if we look at the sector, decarbonization of non-power generation sector is very difficult. Left-hand side is a primary energy demand, and then we see that even if we introduce as many technologies, advanced technologies as possible, it will remain the same amount of energy consumption, although renewables will increase. And how much will be addressed in terms of energy-related CO2 emission by different sectors is that the power sector will reduce radically from the current level down to this level by 2050 in advanced technologies scenario, but non-power sector will struggle. So we have to address this sector where the other than power generation sector, like the industrial sector or the transport sector, to reduce the CO2 emission. Next, please. So in this sector, why it is difficult? Non-fossil energy in the power sector, again, will steadily increase. Starting with nuclear, then the hydro and geothermal, we will add more of the biomass and then the solar power and wind. Therefore, their use of the non-fossil energy will increase very steadily in comparison to the current level into the future, while in the non-power generation sector, it is very scarce as solid biomass is talking more about the traditional biomass such as wood in the developing countries, they are supposed to how do I say, decrease while they shift away from the traditional wood kind of solid fuels into more efficient modern fuels. Therefore, what we are talking about in introducing is this part, the biofuel, biogas, or geosolar thermal, which we don't see as much as those in the power generation sector. Next, please. So here comes some potential. We talked about the circular carbon economy scenario last year, and then that actually includes mainly talk about the hydrogen and ammonia. But if I explain a little bit about the circular carbon economy, that actually utilizes 4R technologies: the reduce, to reuse, to recycle, and remove. And for the reduce part or the reuse part, we have these hydrogen ammonia technologies. And those are produced either by utilizing the natural gas and then they put the CO2 immediately underground by using the CCS, or from the renewable power with the electrolysis, so we can actually produce the hydrogen. We often call them blue hydrogen or green hydrogen, and in our scenario, the both will supply increasing demand of the towards the hydrogen and ammonia by 2050. Actually, we assume that the hydrogen technology will start to pick up after 2030, and then will reach this much amount by 2050, which is 400 million tons, and then that is actually about half of the current level of natural gas demand. So if we are to introduce this hydrogen or ammonia, we expect them to be used mainly in power sector, but also in industrial sector or transport sector and in building sector, so that it will address the non-power generation sector. So we have some hope that these will address the demand for the heat, which are main part of the industrial sector's energy demand, and then that will also have the advantage of utilizing the existing gas pipeline or gas station, which can be turned into supplying the hydrogen or ammonia. That would be a big advantage to introduce hydrogen and ammonia into the future. Next, please. So after introduction of the hydrogen, this will be the way it looks in the primary energy demand. You can see that the level of the primary energy demand will stay about the same as the current level or even nearly to the advanced technologies level. But you can see that the use of the non-fossil fuel will increase, and then we will see the reduction of energy-related CO2 emission, not only in the power sector, but also in the non-power sector in this circular carbon economy scenario. So that is the advantage. Next slide, please. Turn now to the some relevant topic for the ASEAN. If we are to set the target of carbon neutrality for ASEAN for 2060, that would be the level of the carbon price we expect in our the scenario exercise. It's about 200 tons per CO2, but $200 per ton of CO2. But if we are to make it earlier as the target of net zero by 2050, that number will actually be higher than for the 2060. And then that is actually the additional cost for ASEAN. That means that the 2050 and 2060 additional cost will be equivalent to 2.9% of GDP for 2050, while it is 22.5% if we are to set the target for 2060 of the annual GDP. So making the target earlier will become more burden for the economy of ASEAN. If you look at the electricity price, it also says the similar thing. The electricity price in the ASEAN will be threefold into the future if we are to set the target even for 2060, while IEEJ net zero scenario says in 2050, if they are to set the target 2050 globally, the global average increase is only 50% increase rather than the 300%. So it is a burden for the developing or the newly industrialized markets, which is still observing the growing economy. So we have to address that part if we are to be carbon neutralized globally into the future. Next, please. But even with the ASEAN countries, if we are to utilize the decarbonized fossil fuels, it has the potential to reduce the CO2 emission rather radically into the future. So the circular carbon economy scenario, introducing a blue carbon or blue hydrogen or green hydrogen has some potential for this part of the world. Next, please. So at the end, with the CCE, the circular carbon economy, we will manage to reduce further, reaching towards the 50% reduction. Of course, we still need to do further. We need to introduce more advanced technologies. We have to disseminate it, and then that can be done through the collaboration, I suppose. And then that would be some part of the discussion today. Next, please. On the last remark, I would like to say a few words about the traditional energy security issue. We all know that in the earlier announcement of the IEEJ roadmap towards the new net zero world by 2050, the upstream investment may not become necessary into the future if we are to radically reduce the demand for the oil and gas. But looking at the oil demand and the supply capacity as of 2025, if upstream investment stops immediately, we may see a gap between the supply and demand. We may have a shortage of the supply as early as 2025. And of course, the investment stops. This is the picture, and then you can see the supply capacity will decrease. Therefore, that kind of gap will happen. Moreover, since the national oil companies have more share of the oil or gas supply, we will see a little bit of the twist in the supply chain. It won't be as diversified as today, and then we may become more dependent on national oil companies in the Middle East or other part of the countries where the oil and gas supply are abundant. And that may fluctuate the oil and gas market. And then that will be of concern for this part of the world. Back to the traditional energy security issue. Next slide, please. And this concludes my presentation of the keyword. You can read these concluding remarks very carefully later, but we have to actually notice that we do not have enough commitment yet to meet the CO2 carbon neutrality by 2050. And also, we also have to be aware, because we are radically moving towards the electric supply, stability and security of such supply will be, it must be improved. And decarbonization in the non-power generation sector is the key to achieve the carbon neutrality. And clean hydrogen and ammonia, as well the synthetic methane fuels using these materials will be required. Of course, the trade relations between Asia and the Middle East will remain unchanged for even if we start utilizing hydrogen ammonia if they are turned into the trade between these regions. We have to be aware that the energy security will remain an important part of our challenge. In order to achieve worldwide carbon neutrality, to promote and share decarbonization technologies is important, and then that should be done through international cooperation. So thank you very much for your attention. That concludes my keynote. If you have any questions, you can ask during the Q&A session. Thank you. Over to you, Junko.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Yamashita, to share us the up-to-date insights from Outlook 2022. And good morning, everyone, wherever you are. I am Junko Ogawa, Senior Researcher at the Institute of Energy Economics, Japan. First of all, thank you very much for all for joining us today for Singapore International Energy Week 2021. IEEJ Think Tank Roundtable, Driving the Clean Energy Transition in ASEAN and Japan. We, IEEJ, are delighted to host this session and invite distinguished panel speakers. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce panel speakers. So please go to the next slide, please. Our first speaker, Professor Jun Arima, is a professor at the University of Tokyo and a senior policy fellow for energy and environment at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. Professor Arima started his career at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and he has contributed greatly to energy and climate policy making for Japan. He also took up various important posts at international organizations with several decades of experience in the field of energy and the environment. The second speaker is Dr. Neil De Souza, is a principal consultant for Argus Media Singapore office. Dr. De Souza has Argus energy transition practice in Asia Pacific and the Middle East. And also he leads policy studies on the hydrogen economy, low carbon vehicle, and renewables. The third speaker, Mr. Swanto, is a technical officer of power, fossil fuel, alternative energy, and storage at ASEAN Center for Energy. Mr. Swanto is an energy enthusiast as he has the background in both non-renewable and renewable energy. The fourth speaker is Mr. Matthew Yale. He is energy transition lead at Accenture. Mr. Yale has been enthusiastically engaging in the field of oil and gas, power and utility sectors for more than 15 years. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce the moderator for this panel, Ms. Yukari Niwa Yamashita. Ms. Yamashita is a director for the Institute of Energy Economics Japan. Ms. Yamashita is in charge of the Energy Data and the Modeling Center of IEEJ, which is responsible for quantitative and qualitative analysis on energy policy issues. Other than IEEJ work, Ms. Yamashita is serving as a visiting professor at the Kyushu University and the 2021 Executive Vice President for the International Association for Energy Economics. So thank you all the panelists for joining IEEJ Roundtable today. So let's move on to the next slide, please. For the panel discussion, each panelist has about 8-minute presentation at the first part of the session and the free discussion at the latter part. And at the latter part of the panel, we would like to post key question or potential question, as you can see on the on this slide. And we would appreciate it very much if panelists kindly touch upon or deal with these questions in the discussion. The first one is what challenges are common between ASEAN and Japan in energy transition? The second one is what is the biggest challenge for ASEAN or any member countries of ASEAN in energy transition? Third, what do you think is the most needed to address these challenges? The fourth one is how do you define a well-managed transition for ASEAN? Final one is how ASEAN and Japan collaborate in achieving net zero. We also would like to save a bit time for Q&A from the audience. So if anyone who has questions to the panelists, please send us text to 2021 Q&A chat box tool. So now let us begin the panel discussion. I'd like to ask Ms. Yamashita to moderate the panel. Ms. Yamashita, if you please.
Thank you, Junko. I forgot to introduce Junko. It was Ms. Junko Ogawa from the Institute of Energy Economics, Japan. She's a senior economist in the environment unit. Okay, so I would like to invite each panelist to make their opening remarks. First, I would like to invite Professor Jun Arima. The floor is yours, Arima-san.
Thank you very much, Yukari-san. And then, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to see you via screen. And then I also thank Yamashita-san for her very comprehensive presentation about the outlook and also challenges. And I'd like to share the perspective area about ASEAN's energy transition challenges. So next one, please. The area our organization is periodically producing energy outlook, incorporating the figures and also outlook from member states. And according to the most recent area's energy outlook, fossil fuels continue to be very much dominant fuel in ASEAN's energy mix towards 2050 under the business as usual scenario on the left side. And on the right side, you could see APS alternative policy scenario incorporating more ambitious actions for improving energy efficiency and also promoting renewables. But still under that case, fossil fuel is dominant, nearly 80% of the total primary energy supply. Next slide, please. This is the comparison of the power generation mix between business as usual scenario and alternative policy scenarios. Again, in the APS, you could see slightly lower share of fossil fuels. In particular, it is encouraging to see lower share of coal, but still coal remains in the energy mix, and nearly, say, 70 to 80% are coming from fossil fuels, even under APS. Next one, please. And as a strong contrast with other regions, ASEAN region will see high CO2 emission growth due to, in accordance with robust economic growth. And in the ASEAN region, on the right side, ASEAN and India will see continuous CO2 emissions growth beyond 2030. And of course, as parties of the Paris Agreement, ASEAN countries are currently making vigorous efforts for low carbon energy transition by energy efficiency and fuel switching from coal to natural gas and, if applicable, renewable energy. However, the Paris Agreement is envisaging global carbon neutrality in the second half of this century. So therefore, as a party of the Paris Agreement, the current emission path may not be compatible, will not be compatible with the envisaged objective of the Paris Agreement. Next one, please. So ASEAN low carbon energy transition scenario was conducted actually in collaboration with IEEJ, Yukari-san's organization, and reflecting global trends to announce carbon neutrality goals. And incidentally, from this weekend, COP26 will start in Glasgow. And this scenario analysis is meant to provide inputs to ASEAN member states in their consideration of their own low carbon energy transition roadmaps. And it uses a model for simulating cost optimal deployment of energy technologies for achieving carbon neutrality in certain target year, such as 2050 and 2060 and so on. And technologies covered include solar PV, onshore and offshore wind, hydro, geothermal, biomass, CCUS, hydrogen, ammonia, and so on. And detailed assumptions were also made on carbon pricing, cost reduction of various technologies, and the renewable energy potential in the region, and development of ASEAN power grid, and hydrogen imports from non-ASEAN region, and CO2 storage capacity. Next one, please. And this is a comparison of primary energy mix between baseline scenario and 2050 carbon neutrality scenario in the ASEAN region. That's the left side. And the right side is, again, the comparison of power generation mix between baseline scenario and 2050 carbon neutrality scenario in the ASEAN region. We have chosen 2050 as an example because there is a growing pressure towards 2050 global carbon neutrality. That is the agenda pushed by Boris Johnson, the UK chair, the Prime Minister of UK, the chair country of COP26. And in the ASEAN carbon neutrality scenario, 2050 carbon neutrality scenario, you can see the share of fossil fuel will be substantially lower, while non-fossil energy such as ammonia, hydrogen, biomass, wind, solar, and geothermal will be much higher, as you can envisage. But one thing is, well, even in 2050 carbon neutrality scenario, that will not be 100% renewable scenarios as, say, advocated by several groups. So we need to have the wide variety of technologies for achieving carbon neutrality in the ASEAN region. So the next one, please. The major policy lessons we have got from this analysis is energy saving and electrification in end-use sectors, combined with a low carbon power supply, utilizing all technologies would be core strategies for decarbonizing ASEAN energy systems. And during transition periods, various kinds of low carbon technologies can reduce CO2 emissions effectively. Low carbon technologies means not necessarily zero carbon technologies. For example, fuel switching from coal to natural gas could play a very much important role as a pathway towards decarbonized future. And cost reduction and international cooperation is essential for decarbonization with affordable cost. And cost optimization scenario, we have presented ASEAN-wide scenarios, but area is in fact in the process of having a dialogue with interested individual country for accommodate their local situation and refine our scenarios furthermore. And that could be useful input for their consideration of their own low carbon pathways to the future. Next one, please. And one thing we have to bear in mind is, the climate mitigation action is not necessarily the top priority in ASEAN member states. In the left, you could see the Sweden, and in Sweden, climate action is without question the top priority, and in Japan, the priority number 3. But in China, 15th out of 17 SDGs, and in Indonesia, 9th out of 17 SDGs. So that means, for developing countries in the Asian region, the job and also education and healthcare and economic growth is more important for climate action. That is reality. So next one, please. So this is the final slide, and I'd like to share now is that first of all, availability and accessibility and affordability of energy supply is the most fundamental requirement for ASEAN countries. And that would be the same even during the carbon constrained world. The ASEAN region will continuously depend on fossil fuels even under other policy scenarios, according to our outlook. The Paris Agreement sets ambitious 1.52 degrees goals. As a parties of the Paris Agreement, ASEAN countries need to pursue low carbon energy transition pathways, aiming at carbon neutrality in the second half of this century. And priorities among 17 SDGs are different across countries. We need to acknowledge that. And pathways towards carbon neutrality could be diverse among countries. One size does not fit all. Each country's specific national circumstances must be taken into account, and decarbonization strategies need to ensure other policy objectives, namely availability, accessibility, and affordability. And given the high priority on poverty eradication, affordability strongly matters in the region. So to this end, technology optimal approach would be needed for minimizing that cost. And also technology development for further cost reduction is crucial. So that ends my presentation, and looking forward to participating in the fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Arima. That was really concise and yet covering a lot of topics under this carbon neutrality challenge. And then that introduced us to the ASEAN world very well. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite Dr. D'Souza. Floor is yours, Ernie.
Thank you so much, Yamashita-san. And Prof. Arima, that was a very good rounded presentation and just leading into this discussion. So today, I mean, what we're trying to talk about is the potential for collaboration between ASEAN and Japan. So we can go to the next slide. So I just need to put this up for a bit. So I belong to Argus Media. It's the single largest independent price assessment agency in the world. Can we move to the next slide, please? And essentially, we've been covering the energy markets for the last 50 years or so. And in the recent times, most of the work that we are doing on the advisory side of the business has been in the energy transition space. And we've been looking at biomass. I mean, in some sense, there's already a collaboration that is happening between, say, Japan and ASEAN in terms of, say, biomass or biofuels and so on and so forth. But I think the question is, how do we accelerate it? Okay, so if we move on to the next slide. So, I mean, in essence, I mean, touching on what Prof. Arima said, yeah, different circumstances, it gives different priorities to the countries in ASEAN relative to developed countries. So essentially, if we just look at, the economic activity, say in Japan, and we aggregate the economic activity in ASEAN, we're roughly about half the economic activity of Japan. Yeah? So very different economic circumstances. You have the bulk of the countries, if you can see the chart on the right-hand side, will actually lower to middle income countries in ASEAN. Hence, when it comes to the energy transition itself, I mean, the issue of actually raising the capital and prioritizing the capital for deployment to green energy, to basically green the grid or to green the power system is a bit of a challenge. Yeah? And on the demand side, there is an issue with regard to willingness to pay. You have a segment of the population that is struggling to fight against poverty, struggling on the day-to-day. So, of course, there's a willingness to pay issue that that faces the region, and hence policymakers are significantly constrained in the policy actions that they can take, because for them they have to consider the distributional impacts of energy policy on the population. So this is one significant constraint, the disparate economic circumstances that we see in the ASEAN region. If you go to the next slide, please. So these charts, per capita energy consumption, a little bit dated, or the energy use. I mean, they're quite interesting in the sense that they show us a very something that we understand quite intuitively. The richer you are, the more you consume. So you can see that on these charts. But the point is that going forward, and what Prof. Arima had shown in his slides as well, as countries develop, as ASEAN develops, the expectation, if we don't move to a decarbonized ASEAN, is that the aggregate emissions that are coming out of ASEAN will increase quite significantly. Yeah, so that becomes a challenge, a major challenge for the region, and given that signatories to the COP16. If you look at the chart on the right-hand side, there's some policy implications for ASEAN's policy makers. So the energy use per capita, the kg of oil equivalent per capita, if you look at where Japan stands relative to the ASEAN countries, it's quite impressive. And if you remember the chart that Yamashita-san presented at the outset, energy efficiency has been one major plank, one major strategy as far as the Japanese policymakers are concerned. I mean, for us in ASEAN, it might be useful to take a leaf out or a page out of this particular strategy and apply it to the ASEAN context. I mean, we've studied issues such as the rebound effect, where when you have energy efficiency improvements, it reduces the cost of energy and hence we utilize more. But there are certain subsectors where the rebound effect is less of an issue. So I think for ASEAN policy members, it would be useful for them to actually look at Japan's experience in energy efficiency improvements and try to then save the energy. That will be a good step towards decarbonization. If we move to the next slide. So this is the other factor that is impeding or providing some inertia in terms of ASEAN towards decarbonization. So what I have over here is the endowments of fossil fuels, whether it is coal, whether it's natural gas, or whether it's crude oil. So for coal, I mean, Indonesia, largest exporter of thermal coal in the world. It's exporting roughly 400 million tons of thermal coal to the world. You have coal deposits in Vietnam that have actually impacted the way the electricity sector has been set up. In the case of natural gas, we have endowments of natural gas in Malaysia, in Indonesia, albeit these are declining. Malaysia is exporting about 25 million tons of LNG. A large part of it, 90% it ends up in Northeast Asia, to Japan, to Korea, to China. And you have crude oil reserves in Brunei and in Malaysia and Indonesia as well. So the endowments of fossil fuels, if you can go to the next slide, they have impacted or rather shaped the economies and the way that ASEAN actually has evolved over time. And so on the chart on the left, we have the crude oil production, natural gas production, and the coal production. So essentially, the idea has always been to utilize your own resources in your backyard to improve energy security, and an important part of energy policy that Yamashita-san also raised. And in essence, what happens is you have some sort of part dependence in terms of utilization of fossil fuels because it is in your backyard. And then the governments also, in terms of the revenues it is that they're getting, they would get some of the revenues from the extractive industries, right? So it creates some kind of inertia where the governments now have to figure out, should we go down the path of decarbonization, how do we then raise revenues, which might reduce as the fossil fuel industry in our countries start to decline or are forced to decline. So this is another challenge for policymakers in ASEAN. If we move to the next slide. So CO2 emissions, I mean, on a per capita basis, it's, as we would expect, quite low in ASEAN just by virtue of the level of development of the countries. But as I mentioned earlier, and as Prof. Arima has illustrated, as the countries get richer, the per capita emissions will rise, which is what causes a big issue. Again, I would like to flag what the per capita emissions in the case of Japan relative to ASEAN. It is quite impressive that the numbers on a per capita basis are relatively low. I mean, this is where the policy of energy efficiency comes into play. for the large part. And of course, the makeup of the economy. If one were to compare Japan to its peers such as Canada and the US and even Germany, Japan does relatively well on this metric. On the left-hand side are the CO2 emissions. So as I mentioned at the start, if we aggregate the economic activity in ASEAN and compare it to that of Japan, we are roughly about half the size of Japan. But when we aggregate the CO2 emissions from ASEAN and we compare it to the emissions in Japan, we are much higher in aggregate terms than Japan. Okay, so this is something which is a cause for concern. And then the question is, how are things improving? So if we can go to the next slide. It's not as if ASEAN has been static. Yeah, so we have been pushing and trying to push renewables, especially on the electricity sector. I mean, we have biofuels mandates in Indonesia for the road transportation sector, the B20 and B30 and so on and so forth. But on the electricity sector, where the renewables are available, the governments have come in and tried to incentivize it. I mean, Vietnam is a stellar example of how quickly, once you have the feed-in tariffs in place, how quickly you can actually rise in terms of share of renewables in the electricity mix here. So Vietnam went from something like 5 megawatts to about 16 gigawatts in a space of 5 years. So there is movement towards decarbonization. If we move to the next slide. So then the question is, how do we accelerate the transition? And then the question is, how is it that ASEAN and maybe Japan and developed countries, how is it that we can collaborate? And so I've just picked out a few of the roadmaps. They might be a little bit dated. Yeah, so these are from a few months ago. And I've not put together all of the roadmaps. There are roadmaps on digitization and so on and so forth. I put fuel, ammonia, hydrogen quite central as to what Yamashita-san alluded to towards the end of her presentation. So Japan has these targets to actually decarbonize the economy using wind, using ammonia, hydrogen, shipping industry. And these are quite challenging, I would say. And so if we think about ammonia, Japan produces roughly about 1 million tons of ammonia or thereabouts per annum. It's importing about 250,000 tons of ammonia. Large amount of it, it comes in from Southeast Asia. So to go from 1 million tons to 3 million tons, there's a lot of effort that will be required. The sourcing of this ammonia, the development of technologies, because in the end, what we are talking about is ammonia as fuel use. And as a lot of us are aware, there are significant efforts from Japanese companies to decarbonize the coal-fired generation by co-firing. So this technology that has to be developed. So there are some plans. And I think if we move to the next slide, that's where ASEAN and Japan could potentially work and collaborate with each other. So I think Prof. Arima also raised the point that technology will be the way forward. Yeah, and as we have seen and as we read in newspapers, and for us who are following these issues, there are several Japanese firms that are taking the lead in developing new technologies, to co-fire natural gas with hydrogen in utility scale turbines. Yeah, blended, or what we call as hang turbines. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries is doing that. You have companies like Chiyoda that are looking at methyl cyclohexane and using it as a means of transporting hydrogen. You have JERA with its experiments in co-firing of coal and ammonia. So the whole fuel ammonia ideas. So technology will be the way forward. Yeah, and so Japanese firms do bring the technology. As far as ASEAN is concerned, I mean, these are technologies that we could potentially utilize. So as I displayed earlier, significant deposits of coal in ASEAN, especially Indonesia. We have an electricity generation sector that is very coal heavy in Indonesia for certain, but also in Malaysia, in Thailand as well. If we can enable the development of these technologies via test bedding, we can open up ASEAN in terms of collaboration and say, look, you all want to trial these technologies at scale. Why not trial them in ASEAN? Yeah, so that will be a good step forward. And test bedding is quite a useful exercise because then we understand how technologies work given the conditions in whichever jurisdiction we're testing them. With the test bedding, what actually happens is policymakers get more involved. They get a better sense of the kind of technologies that are out there that could potentially work. Yeah, so the idea of, so in a sense, if we test bed in ASEAN, if we help in accelerating the deployment of these technologies, conceivably the costs of these technologies will help in accelerating the decline of costs. And for ASEAN, as we have seen, we are quite cost sensitive to our energy. And if we are going the decarbonization route, we would need that these technologies become cheaper such that they become more ubiquitous. Yeah, and even on the production side, I think there was something quite interesting on Prof. Arima's presentation where when they had done their modeling, they were looking at imports of hydrogen into ASEAN, or at least that's what I read it as. There is a potential for ASEAN to actually also collaborate and basically be a supplier into Japan, yeah, to develop these chains. Yeah, so I mean, when we think about hydrogen, we often think about SMR, the steam methane reforming from natural gas with CCS. We often think about electrolysis, but we can also do it via biomass gasification. And as I mentioned right at the outset, in a sense, with the feed-in tariffs in Japan for biomass power generation, ASEAN has been, Vietnam has been supplying Indonesia and Malaysia. We have been supplying the palm kernel shells and the wood pellets to Japan. And in a sense, there might be potential for ASEAN to be producing the hydrogen or ammonia and then participating in the decarbonization in Japan going forward. So the chart on the right is basically just an illustration of the cost. Yeah, you have 100% coal-fired power plant, that's in black, and then you have a bunch of costs where you have 20% co-firing with ammonia, and then different prices or different costs of ammonia. So the point is that in the end, there is going to be an increase in the costs of that faces the customers, yeah, on account of decarbonization. It's something that policymakers do need to take into consideration. If you move to the next slide, please, and I'll just wrap up. So multitude of technologies, I would echo what Prof. Arima has mentioned. We need to be neutral in terms of the technologies that we actually choose because we have different circumstances in each country. Continue with promoting wind and solar. Energy efficiency becomes quite important. In terms of the energy transition, is if we could bring about a mindset change, yeah, potentially being this hub that is exporting maybe hydrogen or ammonia to Japan, to Korea, and countries that need it, we might think about it as an opportunity to grow the macroeconomy rather than impede the macroeconomy in Southeast Asia. And then the third point is enabling the transition. If we in ASEAN can be test beds, we can help accelerate the development of the technologies, hopefully help lower the costs such that in the next few decades, we can adopt it ourselves here in ASEAN. And the last point, I think it's important in a sense that as countries, we need to have roadmaps. Yeah, so Japan with its basic strategy, there is a roadmap, there is a target, it needs to be fleshed out even further. But I think ASEAN can take a page out of Japan's book and start developing these roadmaps and these ideas and flesh them out further. Yeah, I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. D'Souza. You actually spotlighted the relationship between Japan and ASEAN, but also you emphasized the opportunities through this carbon transition. And you also echoed with Professor Arima about the drawing roadmaps, specifically for individual countries, not unified or universal roadmaps which apply to ASEAN as a whole. So thank you very much, Dr. D'Souza again. And I would like to now invite Mr. Suwanto. Floor is yours, Suwanto.
Thank you, Ms. Yamashita. First of all, allow me to convey thank you to the Institute of Energy Economy Japan for inviting ASEAN Center for Energy in this roundtable. We are pleased to share our views on the energy transition in ASEAN. And talking about ACE, or ASEAN Center for Energy, is an intergovernmental organization within the ASEAN structure, and it represents the 10 ASEAN countries in the energy sector. And so we are working on the overall energy types, including the effort to drive energy transition in the region. To start my thoughts on energy transition in ASEAN, I'm presenting the key findings and learning from our latest ASEAN Energy Outlook that was published last year. Next slide, please. Energy transition acceleration itself is clearly stated in the ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation, or APEC Phase 2. The APEC itself is a regional blueprint for the energy cooperation in ASEAN that covers 7 program areas, including power grid, and then trans-ASEAN gas pipelines, clean coal technology, energy efficiency and conservation, renewable energy, and then regional energy planning and nuclear energy. We bring the innovations and regional and international cooperation to accelerate energy transition and to strengthen the energy resilience, which helping to achieve energy security, energy accessibility, energy affordability, and energy sustainability. Next slide, please. ASEAN, which home for more than 600 million population and has a combined GDP of more than $7 trillion USD, with its shift from the agricultural sector to industrialization, the region is becoming one of the world's global growth drivers and a vital economic force. Due to its rapid economic growth, it is projected that ASEAN regional GDP will reach around 20 trillion USD by 2040, with an annual average growth of 5%. In this regard, this will lead to a significant rise in energy demand in the future. So according to the our outlook, it is projected that the primary energy demand will nearly double in 2040 compared to today's condition. And similar to Professor Arima's presentation, that fossil-based generation is still expected to dominate the energy mix in the region to secure energy supply and also to maintain grid stability due to higher penetration from solar and wind energy in the future. And ASEAN countries also acknowledge the need for transitioning into a low carbon economy, so it is expected to increase renewable installed capacity in the long term. Next slide, please. As explained earlier, that ASEAN will still rely on fossil fuel as the energy source, even though renewable energy is projected to grow in the upcoming decades. We noted that ASEAN has become net oil importer since 2005, and we studied that without any significant reserve or discoveries and exploitation of domestic resources, ASEAN would become net importer of natural gas started in 2025 and coal since 2035. This would raise the issue on energy security and affordability while we are on the pursuing energy sustainability. Next slide, please. ASEAN region has set 23% of renewable energy share on the total energy mix into 2025. The figure shows that in the baseline scenario, the gap would be around 9.4 gap from the target, while in the ATS or ASEAN country scenario, close 5.4 percent point gap from the target. So if we want to achieve ASEAN target as reflected in the APEC scenario, this implies more effort to meet the target compared to the current condition. So one of the effort, for example, is building a regional collaboration to create economy of scale. Thus, renewable energy development would be more economical or more efficient to be developed. And we should also note that in the term of the capacity, we should doubling the installation on the solar and wind to pursue the target on 2025. Next slide, please. Our energy outlook has also highlighted 5 key things that guide us towards energy transition path to address energy issues on policy challenges in ASEAN based on the finding from the outlook. First is enabling the power interconnection within ASEAN to create cross-border electricity market and could make renewable investment more profitable. It could also enhance grid stability and improve the energy security. The next one is we are aware that ASEAN still needs fossil fuels, but we should perform the effort to reduce emission from fossil fuels by fuel switching, for example, by applying LNG to power and then introducing small-scale LNG in the small region, and also application of clean coal technology, for example, co-firing system, and then use high efficiency, low emission coal power plants, and also introducing or apply the CCUS or carbon capture utilization and storage in ASEAN. The next one is, as the demand on cooling system is growing rapidly in ASEAN, we should also make sure that the application of cooling system is in the sustainable ways. And in the transport sector, as the transport sector contributed around a quarter of fuel consumption and the emission, we should consider adopting electric vehicle and utilization of biofuel to substitute the oil products on the transportation sector. And lastly, to improve the quality of life and human health, we could promote electric school stove to replace traditional biomass. Next slide, please. The outlook also identified the policy implication and recommendation for some key energy consuming sectors. The first on the transport sector, apart from promoting EVs and biofuels, we could also keep pursuing the vehicle efficiency and then strengthen vehicle emission standards and also make a good public transportation. And for the industrial sector, as the industrial sector consumes huge amount of energy, some kind of promoting energy efficiency and renewable energy adoption could also be applied. For the residential and commercial sector, we may apply stricter efficiency standard for the appliances to achieve energy savings. And last, in the power sector, we may conduct improvement on demand side and deployment of energy storage while continuing integration of renewable energy into the grid. Next slide. I think that's all for us, and thank you. Back to you, Ms. Yamashita.
Thank you very much, Mr. Swanto. You showed us in more details what are the policy options which the ASEAN as a whole can think of in considering each country's specific needs. Now I would like to invite our last speaker, Mr. Yeo. Floor is yours, Mr. Yeo.
Hi. Just to check, you can hear me, Yamashita-san. I had to change my audio.
Fine.
Okay. All right. I guess quick introduction of who I am. I am the energy transition lead for Southeast Asia for Accenture. A quick fun fact about me. 2 of the logos on this page I have history with. So I was involved in organizing one of the first SIEWs in the Energy Market Authority, and until fairly recently, I was an employee of Sembcorp. So shout out to all my colleagues, ex-colleagues who might be listening in. Next slide, please. So just to call out that sustainability and energy transition, this conversation has been around for a long time. And I recall that when I was in the EMA, we did a study trip to Japan, and I must have met some of our Japanese colleagues on the panel here, or at least your colleagues. And thank you for your leadership and your involvement in the region in terms of energy transition. Energy transition, of course, has been around for a long time, but it's becoming very much more real today. And I won't talk about all the factors on this page, but in particular, just to call out that investors are actually, investors are actually pressuring companies to go towards cleaner sources of energy. So you might have heard that Singaporean, Japanese, South Korean banks have made announcements not to fund coal-fired power generation anymore by in a certain time frame. Other factors, consumers are demanding it. Regulators have made announcements to, or rather, regulators are sort of tightening carbon emissions. Recently, we had a conversation with one of our clients in Indonesia, and they said, we want to brand ourselves as clean because it helps us to attract good talent. So employees, employability, talent is also another issue. Just want to call out that technology has made a big difference. So not just in terms of reducing the cost of renewables generation, but also in terms of managing renewables, in terms of managing the operations and maintenance of renewables, managing the sort of output of renewables. Next slide, please. Won't talk too much about this, but just to call out that energy transition, this particular transition or this particular sort of phenomenon is quite different from other transitions or other shocks to the market. So if we talk about oil price fluctuations, etc. These were very supply driven, but energy transition, decarbonization today is driven by societal factors. It's very wide ranging. It's driven by demand. And so it's something that is quite different from what we've seen in the past. And it's quite fundamental as well. Next slide, please. Again, it is a unifying theme across Southeast Asia, energy transition, but no one is committed to net zero carbon, even though specific companies say like Petronas have committed to net zero by 2050. This is not a criticism to ASEAN or on ASEAN countries, but rather to call out that it is not an easy task to go towards net zero carbon. And while all these countries have said, right, we'll reduce, we'll put a certain percentage target on renewables generation as well as reduction of carbon, it is not easy because the region is growing, as pointed out by all the previous speakers. Demand is going up, and there are challenges in terms of sort of meeting the power demand growth much. What more trying to go towards clean energy. So just to call out that, we all have targets, but no one has really, it's quite onerous to go towards net zero carbon, at least for this region. Next slide, please. And again, echoing what many of the speakers talked about before, region, ASEAN, Southeast Asia is still very much codependent. While we say that, renewables have reached sort of cost parity with conventional power generation in Southeast Asia. You will find that many renewables generation in many specific countries actually is fairly costly, and part of this cost is because there is a need to upgrade the grid as well. So this is an oft-forgotten point, I guess, which is that you can, plant solar, you can plant, I suppose, wind to a certain extent in Southeast Asia, but managing that intermittency, managing the, just plugging in renewables into the grid presents several sort of very real challenges for the management of the grid, and this has to be handled, through grid upgrades to technology to supplement the grid, and that comes as a cost as well. So it's not easy to go towards energy, or rather to go towards net zero, as Dr. D'Souza pointed out as well, technology is very key in this question, in this issue. Next slide, please. But it is not all sort of difficulty, challenges, etc. There are very good reasons for Southeast Asia to move towards cleaner energy. One of which is there's a lot more manufacturing that's coming to Southeast Asia, and with that will come buyers of products globally who demand that products are produced in a sustainable way, and products are produced with clean energy. So this is a motivation for countries to go towards to increase their clean energy capacity. Vietnam is one example. Indonesia, another one, moving very aggressively towards renewable energy. Fixing the wealth gap with renewables with countries like the Philippines and Indonesia, which are archipelagic nations. You have many sort of distributed needs for power generation in the islands. In these circumstances, in these sort of use cases, power generation through renewables actually makes makes more sense, because a lot of these far-flung areas, generation is done with fuel oil, with diesel. These are expensive. So if you can bring renewables there, it's actually a cheaper way of electrifying rural areas. Last point, sustainable finance is a big deal. I touched on this before. Investors are moving in this direction. Therefore, there's positive pressure to move towards clean energy. Next slide, please. Just to point out that for companies who are moving to net zero, who are trying to plant or rather to try and shift their operations, there's many things that they need to consider, and one of which is things like their investment policy, how they evaluate investments. So say if you are an oil and gas company, your investment process is used to handling sort of large risky projects like oil production platforms or oil drilling platforms. It's quite a shift to move towards having to approve several tens or hundreds of, say, renewables projects in a year. So the whole investment process has to shift. The other example that I always, talk about is you move from maintaining large coal-fired power plants, gas-fired power plants, to maintaining, say, a whole array of solar plants. It's a very, very different kind of operating model, very, very different kind of skill sets needed. With solar, probably lower complexity, but you need an army of, say, cleaners or people to sort of inspect the plant, the panels, make sure that they're clean and etc. So a very different kind of operating model, very different kind of sort of capabilities required, and this requires quite a big shift. And we talk about companies having two operating models: one for the traditional business and one for the sort of renewables new kind of business. Next slide. Just the last one, call out to why technology and digital is important. With the key defining characteristic of renewables is that they are distributed, and there's a lot more sites when you go towards renewables. So instead of one single gas-fired power plant which can generate 1,000 megawatts, 2,000 megawatts, or single coal-fired power plant that can generate a lot of electricity, you move to several hundreds, tens of distributed solar, or rather not distributed, but rather tens of sites to meet that same amount of generation. And with this sort of setup, then comes more complexity. There are technologies which help to reduce the cost of maintaining all of this sort of setup. There's technology which helps to reduce the capital cost of planting, say, for example, using artificial intelligence to look at where best to plant solar to get the best sort of returns. So just to call out that technology is quite a key factor, digital especially, and this is enabling renewables with data analytics, with new analytical methods. With that, next slide, I'll end my presentation. Thank you, Yamashita-san and speakers, for this opportunity. Look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yeo. You brought in some practical tips for the private sector, as well as for the maybe the government policy makers. Especially, I thank you for bringing in the kind of the constructive advice that we should not forget about digital technologies, which are enablers for the challenges we are facing in accommodating the valuable renewable electricities. Okay, so I have such a splendid panel that I feel as if I don't have to go into discussion, but we have plenty of time left for the panel discussion, and I would like to visit some of the questions which Junko Ogawa introduced to the panel earlier. First and foremost, I would like to ask all the panel the same question. Actually, maybe some of you have already mentioned, but I think reiterating is also very, informative for the audience. So I would like to invite all the panel to raise your hand and then say something, a few words. What challenges are common between ASEAN and Japan in energy transition? Some of you have already mentioned, I remember very clearly, but it's nice to reiterate. So what point you would like to raise as the most, important maybe for the ASEAN people to share with the, all these the questions that we are asking every day, how to meet the energy transition, and then how we can share the knowledge between the Japan and ASEAN. Anybody volunteers? Yes, please, Professor Lima.
Yes, thank you very much. And of course, there are commonalities and differences, but the common challenges I'd like to point out first, the growing import dependence of energy from overseas. And Asia Pacific region is increasingly dependent on Middle East for oil supply. In that case, the ASEAN and Japan share the common challenges. The second challenge is, the grid size for accommodating variable renewable is limited. And in ASEAN, there are many archipelago countries, and the grid connection is not as strong as expected. In Japan, we have two frequency systems, and also grid connection between Northern Island and main island is not sufficient. So that is the one of the constraints for larger penetration of variable renewables. And maybe I think the more unique challenge for ASEAN country would be, maybe I could go to your second question, but the unique question, the challenge for ASEAN country is, it is more challenging for ASEAN countries to say simultaneously achieve affordability of the energy cost and the low carbon future. And I think sensitivity to the higher energy prices would be more acute in ASEAN countries because development stage is different. So that is a very unique challenge. So I'd like to say that, this energy reality of ASEAN region needs to be more publicized, the global debate, including that ongoing in COP. Because, people gathering in COP tends to say push one size to all the countries. They tend to say that we should achieve 100% renewables and we should achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 and so on. And we should phase out coal by 2030 or 2040 or something. That kind of simplistic, vision is not in line with the energy reality we are facing in the ASEAN region. But in order to reflect that kind of reality in the global debate, I think ASEAN countries need to speak out more in various occasions. And, including us, Asian people are modest and quite often silent in this sort of international debate. But since the financial sector is moving towards this direction, withdrawing investment from fossil fuel sectors or coal-fired power sectors, and even some natural gas sectors, but that is not pragmatic way for achieving a lower carbon future and ultimately to decarbonization. So I think messaging from ASEAN countries is quite important. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Lima. I echo your concern. We have been trying to say that to the world, especially to the European people, that the Asian needs are different. Our circumstances are very different, and we are growing. Therefore, we need still the fossil fuels, and then we have to admit that we cannot jump from today's stage to the 2050 carbon neutral stage, the overnight. Therefore, please do think about the transition period. That's what we have been saying. And then I echo Professor Arima that we will be happier if ASEAN people start saying that also to the European or the rest of the world. So, okay, hands are up. I missed who was first. Maybe for a change, I will ask Mr. Yeo to speak first.
Thanks, Yamashita-san. I guess Professor Arima made a lot of the points that I was going to make, so I'm going to keep this short, and it's a way for me to cheat on this panel. But I would just, I guess, point out one thing, which is that there is, a social economic angle to all of this, and as you said, and we all said that coal is very dominant in Southeast Asia, and with that comes a whole coal economy, and Indonesia is one of the key. I guess there are a lot of coal mines in Indonesia. There's a lot of companies which are built on the coal economy. So it's again not an easy matter of saying, okay, we just switch 100% to renewables, or large percentage to renewables. What's going to happen to the coal economy? And incidentally, coal prices are at an all-time high as well. So these countries, say coal miners in Indonesia are taking advantage of this to export coal. So this it is a very sort of a fundamental question, which is, while we think about investing in renewables, investing in the grid, we can't leave the coal miners behind, people who are dependent on the coal economy for a living. One of the, I guess one of the things that can be done is for these two, I guess, technologies or forms of generation to sort of be move in parallel. So can the coal miners, or can companies which are base their revenues on coal-fired generation, can they start to incorporate, say, carbon capture technologies into coal-fired generation? Can they start to plant more solar to offset the carbon generated from coal-fired generation? So it has to be a kind of managed transition, rather than say, okay, let's just go towards net zero and plant solar and wind everywhere, and then that's it. There can be a lot of casualties that come out of something like that. So I think that is probably one of the bigger challenges for ASEAN when you think about moving to lower carbon future. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a typical case of devil is in the details, I think. Okay, Dr. Souza?
Yeah, sure. So I'm actually gonna have to borrow from Prof. Arima and Matthew again. Yeah, but I think I'll just say one thing. So for us, right, in terms of commonality of an issue, is basically baseload. Yeah, it's like, how do we, whether it's Japan or whether it's ASEAN, where are we getting our baseload power from? And coal, by virtue of policy in the past in Japan of ensuring that you have energy security and a diversity, coal does form a significant part of the electricity mix, from roughly about 44 gigawatts of installed capacity. In ASEAN, again, we are so strongly dependent on coal. And so that's one issue that we have to tackle in both jurisdictions. And I think that's where some of the technologies that are coming out of Japan, ultra supercritical plants, and certainly, there, but also on the potential for the ammonia co-firing and the experiments by JERA, Chugoku Electric, and so on and so forth, they become quite important to ASEAN and decarbonization, because in terms of CCS in ASEAN, we still have a long way to go in even mapping out properly the potential at the national levels, in order to decide, are there enough of locations where we can sequester permanently? I think that becomes quite an important part of the issue. So for me, like baseload power, that's a commonality of the problem for Japan and ASEAN.
So of course, I agree. And then we touch upon the potential, how to say, the helper from the ammonia and hydrogen later when we discuss some technologies. Okay, I would like to invite Swanto-san.
Thank you. I think we saw from the IEEJ outlook and echoing Professor Arima and also Matthew that IEEJ outlook and ASEAN outlooks both said that ASEAN and Japan have high reliance on fossil fuels. So we have a common issues on reducing energy source from fossil fuels, and now we are trying to boost the growth of renewable energy and boosting the renewable energy. We by higher penetration of renewable means higher fluctuation of power production, and ASEAN and Japan are still seeking good practices of energy storage application to help maintaining grid stability and also to ensure stable energy supply for the consumers. So as part of renewable energy development to create reliable electricity production from renewable, so we need some kind of good energy storage to support the renewable energy. So in terms of the cost, renewable energy storage are also still considered higher, and we expect that both technology will reducing in the cost, so we can enable to apply the technologies massively in the decarbonization efforts in the future.
We have covered more or less the two questions together. What are the common challenges, and then what is the biggest challenge for ASEAN? But Mr. Yeo wants to add something, so I would like to invite you.
Thanks. I just a thought came to my mind just listening to Dr. D'Souza's comments. Yeah, because you talked about carbon capture and I guess the cost as well as where to store it. And it just occurred to me, and a comment was made to me by someone I can't remember now, but I remember the point, which is that Southeast Asia is probably one of the regions, or rather the region in the world which has the largest potential for carbon capture because of the large, I guess, the length of the coastal areas or the coastal areas. And a lot of this is, there's already a lot of mangrove, which is this plant which is very good at storing carbon. Perhaps that could be something that could be harnessed as well. I mean, Philippines, Indonesia, Pak Suwanto, it's 200,000 islands or how many thousand islands, depending on the type. So if maybe there is potential, a lot of potential there, and we tend to think of carbon capture as something very technology driven, something that and it's a very expensive kind of technology. But just a thought that popped into my head is it may be just simple issue of just planting mangrove, and maybe and it can turn into an economy in and of itself. Selling off parts of land. Parcels of land for carbon capture, for natural carbon capture methods, and companies could buy up these to and generate carbon credits and sell it on the carbon credits market. So thought that I guess popped into my head listening to Dr. D'Souza's comment.
But maybe you should remember whom to credit. But it was a very brand new idea I have never heard of. So should I invite Dr. D'Souza to maybe to emphasize your point?
Sure. Point? So Matthew, yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, what you're talking about is basically offsetting of the emissions. That's a complementary approach to what is required. And what I was getting at is more on the CCS, where you have a coal-fired power plant, you have a capture system, despite the fact that the CO2 levels are quite low in the flue gas, and then basically taking it and storing it in the ground, something like what is happening on the Northern Lights project in Europe. So that part of it, as far as ASEAN is concerned, certainly in terms of the saline aquifers, the fact that we have oil and gas reserves in the region, there's certainly significant potential to be putting it into the ground theoretically. However, the governments in the region, they would do well in order to actually map these out and start getting the companies to think about the optimal locations where they can sequester the carbon permanently, or for significant. Then that becomes quite an important issue. So Pertamina has already taken the lead in this area. Yeah, so very recently they've looked at CCS, and even the coal industry in Indonesia is looking at CCS, and because they're thinking about the gasification route. You have the whole coal to chemicals, or the coal to, you can produce hydrogen, from coal, and then seriously looking at CCS. But the question is, this is where the governments come, where the geological surveys or associations in the countries come in, map out the potentials, and conduct exercises to test the potential to sequester the CO2. So that'll be an important fillip, in addition to what you mentioned in terms of the carbon offsetting schemes that are potential using the mangroves, which are a significant sink for carbon.
I see. Yeah, I heard of the Pertamina's effort, and I believe Japan is also involved in that, as well as the Asian Development Bank. So now floor is to you, Professor Arima.
Yes, and in short, I think without CCS or CCUS, it is absolutely impossible for ASEAN region to decarbonize its economy, because given its continuous dependence on fossil fuels, this technology is absolutely necessary. And also for hydrogen economy, I think the bulk of the hydrogen will be produced for the time being from fossil fuels. Again, you need CCS technologies for neutralize CO2 emissions coming from them. So that is why Japan and area has established the ASEAN CCUS network for comparing experiences and those best policy practices, believing that this technology is really absolutely essential for the region. And according to the GCCSI Global CCS Institute, as Yeo-san said, there seems to be abundant CCUS potential in this region. But in order to reduce the pressure for storage capacity, carbon recycling could be also interesting solution for using carbon for producing fertilizer or cement and so on. So, and that could improve the economy of the CCUS process. So the carbon recycling should be also pursued. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Arima, especially mentioning that network which has been created just recently this year. Okay, over to you, Mr. Swanto.
Yes, yeah, the topic about CCS and CCUS is very interesting, and this is one of the key to pursue the net zero or carbon neutrality. And ASEAN region has potential or promising geological storage in the sea or in the salty water, or we have so many depleted oil and gas reservoir. So, but the challenge is the challenge of CCS is how to make it profitable. So, because we are almost no profit from the CCS operations, but one thing that we could pursue is by applying a carbon pricing or carbon tax, so we can allow the private sector or the government to develop the CCS and CCUS in the future. So without this, I think this would be very challenging to make CCS and CCUS profitable in the future. Sorry, Yamasita,
Sorry, my mic was mute. Thank you very much, Susan. And actually, I saw some question from the audience regarding carbon tax. Maybe I would like to ask the panel to answer that very quickly. The question is, carbon tax has been touted as a tool to accelerate the adoption of low carbon technologies like CCS inclusive. How should the carbon tax be structured such that it doesn't burden the economy and public consumers? That is a challenge for affordability. So how do we design that? Okay, I throw that at you and then you ponder on it and then I can continue. That's a question I would like to ask you at towards the end of this session. Okay, so we have covered CCS, but I also would like to invite Mr. Yeo on your fantastic idea about addressing the scarcity of the energy supply in the local area. The so-called distributed electricity supply, we can utilize renewables. That is actually ideal to supply energy to the rural area. And then would you like to talk more about that? I thought it was a good solution to address the affordability or accessibility to the energy in the Southeast Asia region.
Yeah, sure. So I guess to point out that when you look at, I guess, if you look at any country or any region, and if you take, let's say, Indonesia as an example, economic development always comes with, with power generation and with cheap power generation. And so if you look at Indonesia, the big islands are the ones, Sumatra, Java, which have developed well economically, and not surprisingly so. I mean, apart from the fact that, of course, they're big islands, they were the seat of even ancient governments and etc. So they've had a good runway to develop. But if you look at traditional forms of power generation, coal-fired power generation, it's concentrated on these islands because you can't plant a coal-fired plant on, one of the smaller islands in Indonesia because these technologies require a certain critical mass. So therefore, they are planted on the big islands, and therefore, with access to cheap power, big islands are able to sort of progress economically. With renewables, it flips the coin, and it's completely different. You can they're completely scalable. You can plant many solar plants, or solar panels, or you can plant a few. So in the smaller islands or the rural areas, then a lot of the power generation then is generated with diesel, with fuel oil. This is expensive. So it's not a new idea. So Yamashita-san, you credit me for the idea, but it's not my idea. It has been, I guess, discussed in many circles. If solar is combined with, say, batteries to provide a stable base load of generation, then the cost of generation could possibly be brought down, or at least it's in parity with say diesel-fired generation. And then if that generation is able, it can power the rural areas more, then economic development can also move to the rural areas, and therefore helps with the economic development of these rural areas. Again, one of the sustainability goals of Indonesia as well. So I guess the last point to make is that it is a question of cost, and because rural areas have probably higher cost of generation through diesel, then it makes that gap easier to close, as opposed to say I want to plant solar all over Java Island, for example. The governments or powers that be will say, well, coal-fired generation is much cheaper. It's very hard for me to do solar. That question is easier to answer maybe in the rural areas where you have more expensive types of generation. The parity will come, easier to these rural areas. And you'll see it in Indonesia's, I guess, tariff for renewables. So the tariff for renewables for the rural areas is actually higher. So Indonesia is moving in the right direction. They are rewarding renewables planting with better tariffs in the rural areas. So it is already happening, and hopefully it does go in this direction, and there's more prosperity to the region, more prosperity to the rural areas.
I see. Yeah, well, I wanted to invite you to mention that, because it is a part of energy transition picture by now, and then that will actually increase the share of the renewable in the power picture as well. It will become the self-sufficient sufficiency rate to go up. So you will not be dependent upon importing the fossil fuels, although panel may be another story, although we have to import panel, but it is a very good example of meeting the sustainable goal target in different ways. Okay, so we have been discussing CCS, and then we have been discussing the distributed energy supply. What about the interconnectivity? Some of you have already mentioned that the interconnectivity is also very important. So why is that? Can you reiterate that the point? Is there any volunteer to do so? Yes, Mr. Swanto.
Yeah, I think it's important. For example, as simple in Indonesia, Java island is very populated with high economic activity in one island with a huge amount of population, while other region, for example, Sumatra or Sulawesi, with lower economic activity and also a lower electricity demand, where the high electricity demand is in the one region. So we need some kind of interconnection between a lower demand to higher demands. And it's also applicable to also in the countries level, for example, in Indonesia to Malaysia and also to Singapore, for example. And it is kind of important thing to make the security of energy supply in the future.
Okay, so I understand that it is you are encouraging the governments of the ASEAN to do so, or is it already on the table?
We are still on the studying it, and we have a coordination with countries to make this interconnection electricity will happen in the future. So it's kind of discussion, and we want to implement this idea for interconnection.
I see. Thank you very much. Hopefully it will be successful discussions to make it happen in the near future. Because we do need, we in Japan, we are not connected. We don't have pipeline, we don't have the network, and then that makes us into the corner of how to do it. And then our nuclear power plants are not so quick in restart. So you can look at us and then they learn from us that what you can do in ASEAN, which we cannot do in Japan, and then you may be more advanced than we will be. Professor Arima.
Yes, thank you very much. That was exactly what I meant to say, because in Japan, our neighboring countries, it's not necessarily, I'd say, easy countries to consider interconnection. But in ASEAN region, you are aiming at the ASEAN power grid, and you have a political will, at least, to connect yourselves among countries. And also in the ASEAN region, there's a large hydro potential, for example, in Lao PDR. And if you have a better connection, then that potential can be utilized in other countries. And also in ASEAN countries, there is an abundant solar power potential. And by better connection, I think you can send the good solar production to high demand areas. So I think it is logical to have stronger interconnection. And one challenge is, unlike Europe, coordination function of the transmission system operators are not, say, necessarily strong compared with the European region. And also how to, say, share the investment burden among relevant countries, that would be another challenge. But I think, that is clearly written, for example, in ASEAN Plan of Action of Energy Cooperation. And also they have already chosen the high priority interconnections. So I think the remaining issue is political will and financial resources. Thank you.
Yeah, another political will required here, but I hope that it will happen. Okay, Mr. Yeo, I would like to invite you.
I guess just a quick comment that, in response to the question of this interconnection, it's there's different capacities for, among the different countries in ASEAN, there's different capacities for renewables generation, of course. If you talk about Singapore, even if you cover the whole of Singapore with solar, it's not going to meet Singapore's power generation, or rather, energy needs. But on the other hand, there's also a different kind of capacity, which is the capacity to stabilize the grid, the capacity to provide spinning reserve regulation, frequency regulation for the grid. So this can be complementary. So say, for example, Singapore has good capacity to, it has low capacity for renewables planting, but good capacity for grid stabilization, for frequency regulation, for spinning reserve, because Singapore, has invested very, very much into gas-fired power generation and stable baseload, etc. So this could be complementary for different parts of the grid. So why waste all that frequency stabilization capacity of Singapore? Why not, if you have that connection, which Singapore already has with Malaysia, but not a large capacity line, that can also be complementary. So Malaysia can export renewable energy to Singapore. Singapore can help with frequency stabilization, as I think one of the announcements made by Sembcorp, I believe in the last 1 or 2 weeks, which is that they're collaborating with Indonesia with import. So there is definitely a lot of this advantage. The other thing I guess I would point out is there is, I guess, increasing need for data centers, and you have all these tech companies which are emerging, Google, and well, they're not emerging, they have emerged, Google, Amazon, etc. And with that will be more and more requirements for data centers and etc. And it is, I guess, it is there's a competitive economic. ASEAN would like more data centers to be planted in ASEAN, because with it comes economic growth and etc. and etc. And these companies who want to base themselves in ASEAN, and with that more economic growth and etc. Microsoft has already, I guess, some time ago declared that they want to build a data center park in Indonesia, for example. So there's a lot of attraction for data centers to be planted in ASEAN, cheap labor, cheap land, etc. But one of the requirements, or rather a lot of these companies will require that their data centers powered by 100% renewable energy. And if you look at Singapore, they can't, because there's a limited capacity there. And I believe one of the requirements is that renewable energy must be generated from the same grid. So you cannot say plant a data, or rather they would not like to plant a data center in Singapore and say import RECs or carbon credits from Europe or from China. It has to be in the same region. So if the interconnection is more mature and is more developed, then there's, then you can market it as a single grid and say, well, come, data centers can be planted here. It's a stable grid, renewable energies abundant, because you can say take renewables from Vietnam or Malaysia, and then it can power a data center in, say, Indonesia, for example, and brings prosperity to the region in general. But as Professor Arima Yamashita-san, you said, it takes a lot of political will, and hopefully it will become a reality. I see it, progressing. Whether it's progressing fast enough, hopefully it will. And there's benefits to everybody, all the countries in ASEAN as a whole. So yeah, not so quick comment to that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yeo. Yeah. You added the two more reasons why we need the ASEAN need to be interconnected. Okay, we are running out of time, and I would like to actually catch some questions from the audience. There is a specific question to Dr. D'Souza. May I? To Neil?
Sure.
Considering the different situation in each country in the region, should the roadmap for energy transition, net zero, to be developed at national level or better at regional level?
Yeah, thanks for that question from the floor. So I think there are two levels to the roadmaps that will have to be developed, and there'll have to be an iteration. So as we've quite clearly demonstrated or seen in all of the presentations, we are very different across the different countries in ASEAN. We have different circumstances in terms of resource endowments, whether they're fossil fuels or whether they are renewable. So certainly at a national level, countries will have to develop their own plans, right? But for the sake of economic efficiency, there would need to be an iteration to develop a regional plan as well. I mean, we just talked about the need for the grid, an ASEAN, a trans-ASEAN grid. And immediately, as the three speakers mentioned, it is economically more efficient at a system level to have a grid that runs through ASEAN. And on the technical perspective as well, it allows us to balance intermittency much better. Yeah, and hence there are some positive externalities to economic growth. So to answer the question, we need the national individually first. Countries like Cambodia and Laos, they need to basically put forth what it is that their plans are given their own constraints and their own ambitions. And then at the ASEAN level, we would need to iterate a plan for the region such that it is optimal for the region. Yeah.
Thank you. And I hope that kind of exercise will bring the political will faster to the table, so that your interconnection plan will be realized much faster than we kind of envision at the moment. I have another question. Oh, yes, I have to come back to this carbon tax question. Does anybody come up with a good or inspiring answer? Okay, let me ask the question again. Carbon tax has been touted as a tool to accelerate the adoption of low carbon technologies. How should the carbon tax be structured such that it doesn't burden the economy and public consumers? Yeah, two hands up. I was not looking at the screen, so maybe I will invite Professor Arima first.
Yes, thank you very much. And on textbook of economics, the carbon tax or emissions trading is a perfect tool for decarbonization. But the reality is not so simple. And also energy consumption is not necessarily, the price elasticity of energy consumption is not so high. So therefore, if you would like to say reduce energy demand or decarbonize only with pricing mechanism, then you need to set a very much high tax rate. And that will certainly the damage the economy, in particular household and also energy intensive industries. So, and carbon tax has another, how can I say, utility, that is revenue impact. if you could use wisely the revenue from carbon tax for energy technology development or subsidies or promotion programs or something, that could be useful. Then you could start the carbon tax with a very much low level of carbon tax, and looking at the situation, you could gradually increase the carbon tax rather than expecting the price effect of the carbon tax. And what makes the situation a bit complicated is, if ASEAN, one ASEAN country consider carbon tax, then ideally, carbon tax could be harmonized across ASEAN region. But this sort of, the tax harmonization is the most politically challenging issue. And even EU did not succeed in such harmonization of carbon tax. So that is why they have introduced emissions trading system as a second choice. And I don't think ASEAN system has such a strong authority to say impose the uniform taxation to the ASEAN member states. So maybe I think that could be more pragmatic to start with a very much low level carbon taxation and gradually increase, and overhauling the energy, overhauling the whole taxation systems. Perhaps you could consider, say, the revenue neutral carbon taxation, say overhauling the energy taxation, and reduce the content of the component of taxation based on energy content, and increase the component of taxation based on the carbon content or something.
Thank you, Professor Rima, for the crash course on the carbon tax. I have 1 minute left, so 30 seconds each for two of you. Okay, I would like to invite Mr. Yeo.
Same points, really. Gradual increase in carbon tax is essential because you can't just impose it suddenly. And then the other thing is that it is a very useful tool to move coal-based economy towards lower carbon technologies. Again, the mangrove idea, coal mines could invest in carbon, I guess, sequestration in that sense.
Yeah, how to use revenue wisely. Okay, I invite Dr. D'Souza.
Yeah, sure. So I just wanted a complementary idea to the carbon tax in terms of subsidies. Yeah, I think for ASEAN, we need to, instead of, it's one thing imposing a carbon tax and gradual, I do agree, that's the best approach so that everyone gets used to it. But I think the complementary idea is to actually ensure that subsidies are gradually kind of lifted such that we're getting to a level where the fossil fuel prices are more reflective. Yeah, I mean, we're not going to include the externality of the carbon dioxide via the carbon tax, but just reducing the subsidies slowly over time, we would get to a more efficient utilization of energy.
Thank you very much, D'Souza-san. Unfortunately, I really feel unfortunate that the time is up. It has been very fruitful discussion. We learned a lot from each opening remarks, and then I would like to continue this. There should be a part 2 of this maybe next year, but I am very happy that we have such an excellent panel, and then I would like to invite all the audience to applaud to them. Thank you so much for joining us, and then that ends this year's IEEJ's Think Tank Roundtable. Thank you, everybody, all the panelists to join us. Thank you very much, and then see you again very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye.